What if I told you that after the 2026 midterm elections, both major political parties in America could look very different than they do today? Not because of one dramatic event and not because the system suddenly disappears overnight, but because both parties are under very different kinds of pressure. If you look closely, the Republican Party is facing growing concern from critics who say it is drifting away from the democratic norms and toward a more personality-driven style of politics. At the same time, the Democratic Party is facing a different kind of risk. Their perception is that it understands the threat, talks about the threat, but does not always move with the urgency, clarity, or force that many voters expect. So this episode is not really about whether one party wins and the other loses. It is about whether both parties are changing in ways that could reshape American politics as we know it. Before going any further, it helps to ground this in something measurable. Public trust in government has been declining for decades, according to Pew Research Center. Only a small share of Americans say they trust the federal government to do what is right most of the time, and Gallup has similarly documented long-term declines in confidence across major institutions. That does not mean every voter sees the situation the same. It does mean the broader system is operating in an environment where skepticism is high, patience is low, and faith in institutions is weaker than it used to be. And once a political system starts operating under those conditions, every disagreement feels sharper, every delay feels bigger, and every institutional failure carries more weight. For most of modern American history, the system depended on a basic assumption. Both major parties accepted the rules of the game, even when they fought bitterly over policy, priorities, and ideology. Elections mattered. The transfer of power mattered. The Constitution mattered. Courts mattered. There were always fierce disputes, but the system still rested on the idea that political competition happened inside a democratic framework. That shared acceptance of process was never perfect, and American history includes many periods of exclusion, hypocrisy, and unequal protection under the law. But the operating assumption still mattered. It created limits, it created predictability, it created a political culture in which losing an election did not mean rejecting the legitimacy of the system itself. Now, let's look at the first major pressure point. The Republican Party. Over the last several years, a number of political scientists, historians, and democratic governance researchers have raised concerns about changes in how power is discussed and pursued on the political right. In How Democracies Die, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt describe warning signs that democratic systems can weaken gradually rather than collapse all at once. Their argument is not that every country follows the exact same path. It is that democracies can erode when key actors stop treating rivals as legitimate competitors, stop respecting institutional restraints, and begin to put personal or factional power above democratic norms. That framework has shaped a great deal of discussions about current American politics. One of the most visible concerns is the increasing emphasis on personal loyalty. In a healthy constitutional system, loyalty is supposed to flow first to the law, to institutions, and to the constitutional order. But when political identity becomes heavily centered on one leader, one movement, or one personality, the incentives begin to change. Criticism becomes betrayal. Independence becomes disloyalty. Institutional resistance becomes framed as sabotage rather than oversight. Critics of recent Republican political trends argue that this is exactly the kind of shift they are seeing. a movement from party-centered politics and rule-based governance toward leader-centered politics, where the most important test is not whether something strengthens institutions, but whether it strengthens the leader or protects the movement. A second concern involves election legitimacy. A democracy does not only depend on people voting, it depends on enough people accepting the legitimacy of the vote once it is complete. When elections are repeatedly described as fraudulent, stolen, or suspect without evidence that holds up in court, the damage can extend far beyond a single race. It can weaken public belief in the electoral process itself. That matters because once voters stop trusting that elections mean what they say they mean, democracies begin to lose one of its most important stabilizing functions. This is why so many scholars focus not just on election administration, but on public willingness to accept outcomes. The legal system can adjudicate disputes, but no court can manufacture democratic culture if large parts of the public no longer believe in the process. A third concern is the broader rise of strongman-style political language. Organizations such as Freedom House and the VDem Institute have documented democratic erosion and increasing authoritarian tendencies in a number of countries around the world. Again, that does not mean the United States is identical to those countries, and it would be careless to flatten important differences. But some analysts argue that elements of the same pattern can appear in many places. An emphasis on strength over process, the portrayal of opponents as enemies rather than rivals, repeated attacks on media and courts as illegitimate, and the claim that only one leader or one movement can save the nation from collapse. The danger of that kind of politics is not simply that it sounds aggressive. The danger is that it teaches supporters to value power more than process. Now, here is the key point. Saying that these concerns exist is not the same thing as saying the Republican Party has already become something entirely different. A more careful and accurate way to frame it is this. Some analysts argue that the Republican Party is under pressure from anti-democratic tendencies and personality-driven politics that could significantly transform what the party becomes. That distinction matters. It keeps the analysts honest. It also makes the point stronger. You do not need to exaggerate in order to see that the party is being shaped by forces that many Democratic scholars find troubling. And if those forces continue to grow, the Republican Party of the future may not look like the Republican Party that many voters once understood. Diffusion and institutional caution. Many Democratic voters and many independent voters who lean toward democratic norms do not just want speeches about protecting democracy. They want a visible plan. They want consequences for lawbreaking. They want clear messaging. They want leadership that understands the scale of the threat and responds accordingly. But one of the most consistent frustrations with Democrats is the sense that they often sound more comfortable describing problems than confronting them in a way that feels decisive to the public. Part of that frustration comes from the nature of institutions themselves. Investigations take time, court proceedings take time, legislative strategy takes time, coalition politics take time. None of that is unusual. In fact, due process and deliberation are central features of democratic government. But the problem is that what is normal inside an institutional framework can look like weakness in a high-pressured political environment. When one side appears willing to break norms aggressively and the other side appears committed to process above all else, many voters stop seeing that as prudence and start seeing it as passivity. Whether that judgment is fully fair is a separate question. Politically, the perception still matters. There is also a messaging issue. Democrats frequently present themselves as the party of norms, decency, fairness, and procedural integrity. Those can be real strengths, but in periods of democratic stress, those values have to be translated into action that people can recognize. If voters believe one side is willing to use power ruthlessly while the other side is unwilling to use lawful power forcefully, they may conclude that Democrats are not equipped for the moment. That is the risk. The danger for Democrat is not just losing an election, it is losing credibility as a party that can actually defend the constitutional system it says it wants to preserve. And once a party loses that kind of credibility, it can start losing the confidence of the very voters who depend on it to act. This is where the two stories collide. On one side, you have a party that some critics believe is being pulled toward leader-centered anti-democratic politics. On the other side, you have a party that many voters see as too slow, too cautious, or too institutionally constrained to stop it effectively. Those are different problems, but together they create a dangerous political environment. If one party is tempted by a liberal power and the other fails to respond in a way that reassures the public, then both parties can change dramatically under that pressure. One changes because it becomes more willing to test the limits of democracy. The other changes because its inability to meet the moment causes voters to question its purpose, its strength, and even its relevance. So when I say both parties here are at risk, I am not saying both parties are the same. They are not. I am not saying both parties carry identical responsibility. They do not. I am saying both parties may be changing in ways that could alter the political system Americans have grown used to. The Republican Party may continue moving toward a more authoritarian style if institutional loyalty keeps giving way to personal loyalty. The Democratic Party may hollow itself out if it cannot persuade voters that it has both the will and the strength to defend democratic governance in practical, visible terms. Different causes, different mechanisms, but potentially profound consequences on both sides. And this is why 2026 matters, not because one election determines the fate of the republic forever, but because midterms often reveal whether pressure is increasing, stabilizing, or being redirected. They tell us whether voters are rewarding escalation, demanding accountability, or searching for alternatives. They reveal whether institutional caution is still politically sustainable and whether anti-democratic rhetoric is expanding or meeting resistance. In other words, 2026 is not a magic date. It is a measuring point, a stress test, a moment that may show how much the parties have already changed and how much further they may still go. The most honest conclusion is not that both parties are over. That would be too absolute. The more accurate conclusion is that both parties could change significantly from how Americans know them today, and those changes could reshape the country's political future. One party is under pressure from the pull of autocratic politics. The other is under pressure from the cost of appearing too passive in the face of it. And if those pressures continue, the political landscape after 2026 may not look like a simple continuation of what came before. It may look like a system in transition. So, The real question is not whether Republicans and Democrats will keep their names. It is whether they will keep their identities, their functions, and their relationship to democratic governance. That is the question voters are really wrestling with, and it is the question that will shape everything that comes next. If one party continues to reward power over process and the other continues to struggle to show that rules still have force, then both parties may emerge from this era transformed. That is not inevitable, but it is possible. And that possibility is exactly why this conversation matters.